Can see. I wanna go where the lame will walk. I wanna see the sick ones clean, where the deaf can hear and the silent talk. Where are you going? To a ghost dance in the snow.
Of course, if you're like me, you've got kids, and everything about holiday weekends is all about kids. But the beautiful thing, as they say, it's the most wonderful time of the year, and that's when, on Tuesday of next week, kids go back to school. So that'll be nice. Sometimes in summertime, it's fun having the kids around, having them home. Other times, just doing the daily routine. Both my wife and I work at home, and so we're here all the time with the kids, and it gets a bit chaotic around here. And so I remember being a kid and having summer and the things that we did. We were never in the house. We were never around. My kids like sticking around. There's not a lot of friends in the neighborhood, and I got to admit, I still am a little nervous sending my kids out on their bike out of my sight. Even my 10-year-old son. When I was 10, oh man, we were all over the place. We would be 4 or 5 miles from home with our bikes, fishing or going to the swimming pool and things like that. So, and by the way, I'm Scotty Roberts, in case you didn't know that, and you're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. You can see the live stream over on my YouTube, and that is youtube.com/Mr. spelled out Mister Scotty Roberts, Mr. Scotty Roberts. And you can listen to the audio and the radio on many different stations and over at odyssey1.com. That's ODYSY1.com. And so this thing of raising kids and having them home at summertime, I love my kids. I love having them around. My little girl, my little 4-year-old, now she won't be going, well, wait a minute, she's going to pre-kindergarten this year. So because she won't be 5 until December, we couldn't get her in kindergarten this year by the rules of the game. And so she's going to pre-kindergarten. She'll be gone a few hours a day. That will give my wife a much needed break during the day. And so I'm looking forward to that. And we'll be able to get some things done here without kids hanging around. So that'll be a lot of fun for us anyway. And for all of you parents out there, congratulations. You survived summer and your kids are going back to school. If they're not already in school, they're going back next week. So have a good time with that. And I hate when I'm doing the radio show and I see messages popping in. They're so mentally distracting sometimes. And I have to get to some of those. So I got to get this show done fast. So this will be a fast hour. And we'll get back to it. And I got to get back to some other clients and stuff like that. So anyway, let's do this. Let's kind of pick up where we left off yesterday. We're talking about this whole thing of the things I learned in Sunday school. Why are they different now? Why does it seem different? Why is there this move away from faith and religion, it seems? In general, I'm talking about there's this general feel that people are moving away from the things that were once the solid things in their life, the things that they could count on. And so I have had to come to terms in my life many years ago that things weren't what they seemed. All the things I was taught were not the things that I thought I could count on anymore. And that was a problem for me. I grew up, watching Star Trek, watching science fiction, watching horror films. Those were the things that drove who I was and into what I wanted to do in my life. And I've said many times, I spend an inordinate amount of time on the roof of my mother's garage at night watching the stars. Now, I was deathly afraid of the dark, but I wasn't afraid of the stars. Getting up there at night meant I had to cross through the dark yard, climb the little tree that was right next to the garage, and climb up onto the roof. That was fear-wracking for me, because there was always something lurking in the bushes that was sure to eat my guts out while I was still alive, kicking and screaming. But once I got up there, my imagination would go with that. Star Trek did that for me as a kid. That was an escape, I found. Star Trek was a way to get away from the things that kids shouldn't have to have. I'm going to rabbit trail here. Kids should not have to have worries in life. Kids shouldn't have to worry that somebody's going to touch them inappropriately, or that bad things are going to happen. They shouldn't have to worry that they're going to have a place to live or food to eat. Things like that. Growing up poor, I don't think we ever feared that we weren't going to eat or we didn't have a place to live. Those seemed the constants. At least my mom kept us protected from that. I remember living really only in 2 or 3 places the whole time I was growing up. I remember when I was a little kid, we lived in a house in North Minneapolis, in a neighborhood that is now not savory enough to want to walk through. But back in the early 1960s, it was a nice place. And but it was a duplex. We were on the lower floor of an old, in my memory, it's like an old Victorian house. That's where we lived. That was our house. But we only had the downstairs. But we didn't really think about there being an upstairs. It didn't matter to us as little kids. And my mom was married to her second husband, who was the only guy I knew as a father or could remember. And he was a Ukrainian man. And by the name of Vasil Nikolajenko. He was my stepfather. Now, he never adopted us, so we never took his name. I was always Roberts. And that didn't occur to me. Didn't matter when you were 4, 5, and 6 years old. I remember when they got divorced. I was 6. And I remember I was just heartbroken at the time. Now, he was an old world disciplinarian, an old world thinker and philosopher. He was a very good-hearted man, but he did things very old world. He spanked, he punished. I got no problems with that in retrospect. But he and my mom didn't get along after a couple of years. Now, my sister was born in that time when I was 5, and so I have a half-sister who I've never, ever in my life, other than mentioning she's my half-sister by technicality, ever thought that way or ever treated her that way, or none of us have ever thought about that. It's my sister. It was we 3 kids, my older brother, my younger sister, and me, and my mom. So when she was divorced, I was 6. That would have been mid-1965 was when they were divorced. And so my little sister was still an infant. And I remember my mom moved to one of those little 4-plex apartment buildings. Now, you remember those? You see them still. Just the little brick buildings that had 4 apartments, 2 down, 2 up, and a front door in the middle to get the hallway to get to your front door. And we lived there for, had to be about a year. And then maybe 10 blocks down the same street, my mom got into a little house on the corner. And that's for me, if you know this reference from the old Loggins and Messina song, The House on Pooh Corner, that was my house on Pooh Corner. That was a house. We had a couple of big elm trees, maple trees, the big poplar trees in the front yard that were 100 feet tall. and the old detached garage with the dirt floor. And we had neighbors down one side, and across the street were just the typical middle-class houses, Ramblers, ranch house type style. And behind those houses were all these open fields that ran for a couple of miles in either direction, full of trees and the long grass. It was like wild forest and pasture land mixed together. And on the other side of that was Lyndale Avenue, busy street that ran along the Mississippi River up in the north of Minneapolis. And so we were about a block away from the river. We rarely went down to the river there. We always went down about 3 miles and went fishing in Shingle Creek, which ran into the Mississippi River. But those fields, we would go out, we'd cut through the neighbors' yards, and we'd go down there and we'd play. There was a big old oak tree that had been felled in a storm or something, and we would climb on that oak tree. We had ropes all over it and climb all over. So those are the things we did as kids. We'd hop on our bikes, we'd go all over, we'd go out to the fields and we'd build forts. We never worried about there being somebody out there that might take us. That wasn't so popularized, if you will, quote unquote, in the 1960s. So the fear wasn't there the way that we thought it should be. And so times have changed since I was a kid. Even in the mid to late 1960s, into the early 70s, and think of the music that was playing back then, all those songs. I was just talking with somebody over the weekend, and I said, there's one song that reminded me of my childhood, and it brings back memories. I remember my mom standing in the kitchen, listening to the radio, the sunshine outside. We were playing, and that song, Just Call Me Angel of the Morning. I can't remember off the top of my head who it was that sang that song. But if you know, put it in the chat room. But that's a song that is indicative of the times of my youth. That song. I remember King of the Road. As much as I listen to that, I go, oh, that is really old people music. Now, when I was a little kid, King of the Road, that song was playing on the radio a lot. And there were a lot of songs I recognized from that era of the early to mid 1960s. And then the 70s came, and of course, all the bands of the early 1970s and all of that. So in this rabbit trail, I don't know where the hell I'm going with it, other than to say, when I was a kid, staying home at summer was great. We played all during the school year. We did stuff. 3 in the afternoon and on was the time you had to play and watch TV and stupid TV. I grew up a product of what was on TV back then. All the ever-present, omnipresent reruns of shows like not only Star Trek, which I lived and died for. You had Star Trek. We watched Dark Shadows, if you remember that. We watched Lost in Space, Gilligan's Island, if you remember that. The Wild Wild West. These were all shows that we just watched religiously. And into the 70s, kind of started the rudiments of what I have been doing the rest of my life. I had a good friend who was a friend of mine in art class, and we got to be good buddies. We met doing they had us painting a big, I want to say would have been a mural if it was on the wall, but it was a big sheet, I think 12 foot long by 4 foot tall sheet of styrofoam, about an inch thick. And they had us painting for the literature department of the high school, the middle school where I was. It would be the English department, because English and literature were synonymous back then. And they had us painting characters from all different kinds of stories throughout literature, all over this thing. And I met him because they chose him because he knew how to paint, and they chose me. And so we two were the young 13-year-old, 14-year-old illustrators that they had painting this mural. And we made that thing stretch out the entire school year. We could have done it in a few days. But we got passes to come to school early. I remember this school, I can't remember what time it started, 7:45, something like that. we got passes to come in an hour to an hour and a half early. We'd be there at 6 to 6:15 every morning. I'd walk to school instead of there was no early bus. So I'd walk the mile to school every day. So my friend Randy and I could paint on this mural. And I remember we had Queequeg from Moby Dick. We had that's the only one that really sticks out in my mind, because I hadn't read Moby Dick yet. I was in the 9th grade, and I think they were just introducing us to some of those old books in literature. Hadn't read it yet, or we read it and I didn't read it, which was normal. Remember that? When you had tests in school and you didn't read the book? It's like, oh my God, I got better things to do than read a book for homework. And so you never read it, but you would sit through the lectures in class about the book, and you'd take all your notes. And that's how I learned some of those books. And the only time you were in trouble was when there was a pop quiz. Remember those 2 chapters you were supposed to read last night? Here's a pop quiz. And you're like, oh my God, I'm doomed. And so anyway, we painted all those characters, and we had a good time with it. But he and I did stuff as friends off school time, too. We started doing, I had a little Super 8 movie camera. And this is back in the mid-1970s now. And early to mid-1970s. And we would make movies. We would do special effects on the film, on the emulsion of the film. I mean, it was all hand-done stuff, and it was ridiculous. Sitting with a makeshift light table and little tiny bits of films. A film that was that wide, less than a half of an inch, and big long strips. And if we wanted to do, we did like phasers from Star Trek. And stop action animation of spaceships flying through space and things like that, set up on a desktop, because I had seen things in little television documentaries back in the 1970s of how Disney did their animations and things like that. And so it was nothing that grandiose, but that's what we did. We started doing that stuff. At the time, get this, we called ourselves Mystic Film, Sound, and Author Studios. And we made little signs and put them on I put mine on my bedroom wall. He put his on his wall. He was a very creative guy, this Randy. And he did stuff that I wished I knew how to do. And he was creative in all aspects. And I don't know whatever happened to him. The last I heard from him had to be in the mid-1980s. I can't he called me on the phone. Remember, we didn't have cell phones back then. We had answering machines. After the beep, leave your message. Beep. And so he left a message for me, and he came over to my place. We met a couple of times. We hung out a little bit. Not anything grandiose. We didn't go out drinking. We didn't go out I don't think we ever even went out to eat. We just went and hung out at each other's houses every now and then. And then I lost track of him. And I haven't found him since. I've done some searches for him, social media and things like that. And I've come up with people with the same name. His name was Randall William Davis, Randy Davis. And he'd be really about my age. He'd be right now 58 to 60, but lost complete track of him. And I did find somebody on social media once, God, maybe 7, 8, 9 years ago, that had the same name and kind of looked like what I think he might have looked like. He was skinny and raily and dark hair, and I thought this was the guy. There were no clear pictures, and I wrote, and I don't remember what social media I was on back then. Might have been Facebook, but never heard back, so I didn't think it was him. And but those were the rudiments of what made me who I was. Those 2 things I mentioned in all this little rambling and rabbit trailing, sitting on my mom's roof, watching the stars, wishing I could be a starship captain, wondering if I would ever have that opportunity, if our science and technology would ever get us that far. Not concerned about the nuts and bolts of it, just curious kid thinking. And that drove who I was, drove me into the things I was interested in. And with the art side of things, with Randy Davis. those were the things that I would attribute to being the beginnings of what I do now. And I have been, of course, for nearly 40 years, I have been doing illustration, design, marketing, all of those kinds of things, starting with a little publisher when I was 17 years old in high school. I got a job with a small book publisher. Remember how I told you I went to high school in a big church that had all the school and the seminary and all that? Well, one of the seminary students was running a theological book publishing company, and we'd take old books, hardback books that were old and falling apart, and they were out of copyright, and he would go buy the new copyright on them. 76 years after publication, a copyright terminates unless somebody picks it back up. And so he would pick them up for these old theological books. We'd cut them all apart with razor blades, all the pages, lay them out, shoot negatives of them. On the negative, we would clean up all the cracks and the rips and stuff like that. And then we would shoot those to plates, and we'd reprint them on a printing press, then send them to the bookbinder. And when I was first hired, he hired me to do drawings for dust jackets, the paper wraps that go around hardcover books. And then I started working on that with him, and I worked with him into my 20s. I became one of the art directors at his print company after he moved to Lynchburg, Virginia, and I went from there to other print companies and other design shops and into advertising and so on. So really, for 41 years, I have been an artist in printing and advertising. And it started in those rudiments. It started with the friends I had. There are times you wish you had the friends that you had when you were young and doing the things that you did when you were young. Now everything is all wrapped around. Whenever I want to get together with friends, it's all wrapped around schedules. What do we have? Do we have Cub Scouts for the kids? Do we have Girl Scouts? Do we have activities that were already planned? Do we have family stuff going on? Which is all important stuff in life. But trying to get together with your friends is then finding out when they have those same things going on in their schedules, how do you find and match up? I just met with an old friend last week or 2 weeks ago, and it took us months to get together because every time we set a date, something else came up, and we had to keep pushing it out. And so it's not like it used to be. We can't hop on our little bikes with the banana seats and the big handlebars and go riding down the street and meet at the old tree anymore. Now times have changed. And so I look at that. All that came off of just a very brief mention of my children being home in the summer. I wish they had the freedoms we had 40 and 50 years ago. And it seems crazy to say it that way. This morning on Facebook, I had a friend of mine that says, "Hey, you and Jim have been friends for 2 years. It's Jim and Scotty Day." Or 10 years, I'm sorry. And I looked at that and I wrote him and I said, 10 years, that's 10 of 26. I met him, he was another friend of mine that I met working on this television series that we were doing where we designed the puppet Muppet type characters and stuff like that. And I mentioned the one friend I had that I met there that built the puppets that I designed. And then I had my friend Jim, who was one of the other artists. So I was a creative director and he was one of our artists. And so we had that's a couple of friends I've met. One of those friends, after 25 years, parted ways with me, just out of the blue because of who I voted for, and I must be a Nazi now, and I mean, he just got all militant. It was just the weirdest thing I'd ever experienced. And I talked to him a couple of times during emails. He would never even meet with me after 25 years of friendship. And I'm talking good friendship. We did a lot of stuff. We had a business together at one point. We traveled together. Our wives and us, we all hung out and stuff like that. And it just ended it overnight because of who I voted for. And my other friend, Jim, he didn't care about any of that. We don't see each other very much, but we talk all the time on social media. So we've known each other for 26 years now. And so that's crazy when you think about that and how far out things have gone and how much times have changed in all that time. And so I like to operate under the philosophy I want to keep my kids' innocence as long as possible. But now I don't dare send them outside. It's just different. I mean, outside, off and running where I can't see them anymore. My son just spent the night at a friend of his, which was, that's how he gets up. But he's 10 years old now. So you know what I mean. Anyway, let's wrap up. We're already at the bottom of the hour of this first segment. And we haven't gone anywhere quite yet other than just me babbling. So thank you for being here. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program. I'm Scotty Roberts, your host. We're going to go out to break. 2 minutes from now, I'll be back. So you just sit there, sit tight, stand by.
They may still haunt this place.
Live in simultaneous broadcast from a hidden cornfield in Wisconsin and some time-forgotten Holy of Holies, Intrepid Radio with Scotty Roberts' Intelligent Talk.
All right, folks, welcome back from that break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on Odyssey1.com, ODYSY1.com, the Odyssey Radio Network. And you're also watching simulcast over in the video stream on YouTube. And my YouTube is youtube.com, obviously, / Mr. Scotty Roberts. And Mr. all spelled out, Mr. Scotty Roberts. So we rabbit trailed quite a bit in that first half hour of this 1 hour show. I could do a 2 hour show, but in my head, that's daunting right now. I used to do a 2 hour show. I've always done 2 hour shows throughout the last 20 years of doing radio off and on. And the first radio show that I had, that wasn't the first one. The first in the second phase of doing radio was I do an hour of political talk, then I do a second hour of having a paranormal guest or talking about the paranormal things, etc. So we're going to get back to doing some of that. Not as much politics. I'm really saving politics for doing the radio show with Rocky Stucci, The Situation Room, which will be on an hour after this show ends tonight. And, now it's Friday, so we don't have a show tonight. But we have a show Sunday night through Thursday night. It's technically, with the Situation Room, that's Monday through Friday. It's Monday out east. Midnight Monday mornings, which is, midnight Sunday night in the Central Time Zone and everywhere else. So technically Sunday night through Thursday night. So our Friday show was early this morning, almost 24 hours ago. So now we're going to be open-ended. But I'm not going to go past my hour allotment on the radio on Odyssey One. Boy, look how much time I can waste just talking about the details of that. Suffice it to say, I don't do 2 hours now. Maybe sometime in the future, we'll see how well this goes. I also want to start getting some guests in here. I didn't want to launch this show last week with guests right off the bat. I wanted to do some talking. I wanted you guys to all get a feel for what I was about, what I do, the things that I adhere to, the things that get my juices going, that run me. And once we've established that, I think you're getting an idea of where I am and how I think. I'm going to start getting some guests in here now. And it's going to, as soon as I get all figured out what I want to talk to about, who I want to talk to, I've got a whole list in my head of people. Some of them were past guests, some are new guests that we're going to talk to, and we're going to start doing that. Maybe not next week, but maybe the week after that. We'll just see how things go. Knock on wood. Got to make things work the way I want them to work before I start going to that next level. So, in a way, I'm like the Knight of Coins in the Tarot deck. The Knights, there's 4 of them in the different suits, and they all represent different things of moving things forward. In some decks, they're shown on horseback. Well, the Knight of Coins is the one who is standing still, because not because he's not moving forward, but because he won't take a step until he has made sure he knows what the hell he's doing. He's plodding. He's plotting. He is meticulous. He plans his work. Now, I've never been known to be one that's overly meticulous. I generally just go, okay, I can do that, and I jump in with both feet, take the lumps and move forward. But with this show, I want to make sure that I do all the right things the right way. And so it's coming, folks. Let's leave it at that. One of these days, we'll be able to take callers, too. And we could probably do it right now. I'm not ready to do that yet with the tech I'm working with so far. I got to make sure I am as set up as I can be to do that. So I just appreciate the fact that you're here, that you listen. Come on over to the chat room, which is live over on the live stream on YouTube. And if you're just listening audibly on air, on the radio, you can go over to my live stream and watch the live stream. There's things that happen here, but I don't have everything. So anyway, something I want to get into before we go much further. Remember a couple of nights I've said I want to show you something here. And we've been talking about, last week I talked about it a bit, and I didn't have the map up. We've been talking about this story in Eden, the creation story, and how it's different from all the things that we learned, that there's more to it, there's more behind the scenes. In a nutshell, I would say the Adam and Eve story and the serpent in the garden story, if they are literal, then we have very mythic beginnings to humanity. If it's a story, a cover story, an encoded story, or an allegorical story, or just simply a myth, we can all understand that. But there are things that we can pull from that story that say, look, it's an encoded message. And I still have a ton of information to go through about that, and I haven't even touched on it yet tonight. But I do want to show you this picture. Let me call this up so you can take a look at this. Now, look at this. This is a map of where the biblical narrative says Eden sat. Now, if you look at this, this is a picture of the Middle East. And you've got the Mediterranean Sea. For those of you who are listening audibly, it's a map of the Middle East. You've got the Mediterranean on the left. Down below that is Egypt, and you see the Sinai Peninsula, the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aqaba, and so on. You see Israel as you're coming up there with the Dead Sea, real tiny. The Dead Sea and the Jordan River going north up to the Sea of Galilee in Israel. And you see Mount Hermon, which is where the whole Nephilim story is said to have taken place. Mount Armon, it speaks of in the book of Enoch. And that's Mount Hermon, where it says that the 200 prefects, the celestial beings from the heavens, came down and set foot on the slopes of Mount Armon. And this is where they made the pact to go in to human women and marry them and have children with them and so on, which was apparently against the law, and God had harsh judgment. If you go to Psalm 82, when I've mentioned that before, where it says, "And Elohim stood in the midst of the Elohim, and he said to them, you are all Elohim," equating them with himself, but he had some control over them, some power over them. And he said, you are all the bright shining princes of heaven. Then he goes on to pass judgment. It doesn't say in Psalm 82 what the judgment was and what it was for. It just talks about it. Well, it was this incident where they came down and intermingled with the daughters of men. Just like Genesis 6:1 is the mirror passage of that. But anyway, that's Mount Armon. If you go a little bit north and east, you'll see Iraq. And you'll see the Euphrates River on the south, the Tigris River on the north. And you see I have over that, right in the smack in the middle, is the Eden region. And down below that you have the city of, the region of Akkad. Below that to the south, you've got Sumer. And you've got these cities. You've got Uruk. You've got Babylon is in there. And Uruk, remember that being the same as the city of Enoch that Cain built. That city is as ancient as mankind that you see there. That's where it's located. And you see above that it says Nod and Iran, just below the Caspian Sea. Well, now right to the north of all of that, you see three little rivers. Well, you see three rivers: the Tigris, and you see some rivers that I've got unnamed. Over on the east or the right, you've got the Pishon River, and up to the north, the Gihon River. And those both spill into the Caspian Sea. And then you see to the northwest, up at the very top, running off the top of the map, is the Black Sea. So this region right in here where it says Eden region, you've got the city of Nimrod is in there, Nimrud. You've got Nineveh is right in there. Well, that region, you see a couple of little tiny lakes in there. Well, probably not tiny when you're standing in front of them, but right in that region there, in the middle of all those rivers, the Gihon on the north, the Pishon on the east, the Tigris on the west, this is the region that the biblical description gives for the Garden of Eden. It was somewhere in that region. And so this is now known as the Eden region. And so if you take a good look at that map, you get an idea. And those listening, if you want to see the map, you can just come over and take a look at the archive of this show anytime. So that is the region we're talking about. That puts a little, to me, when you look at maps and you look at history, you look at archaeology, you look at anthropology, all those things put meat on the bones of a mythological tale. Now, the question is still asked. That doesn't prove that Adam and Eve existed. It doesn't prove that Cain and Abel existed. All it proves is that there was a region that the writer was referring to when he wrote about those stories. So the whole story does smack of an analogy. In the Hebrew account of creation and the first family in the Genesis text, Adam and Eve were this first human couple. They were created by God. They were placed in a beautiful paradise called Eden. Their mandate was to till the ground and keep it for God. And the only prohibition was eating from those two trees at the center of the garden. They couldn't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We always think there's only one because it really is kind of obscure in the text. But then there was also the tree of life. And they ate of the knowledge of good and evil, that tree. So now let me ask you, were there actual trees, do you think, in this story? If there's any truth to this story, if there's anything about this story that smacks of being the truth beginnings of humankind, was there a tree that was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? And was there an actual physical tree that was the tree of life? Now the mandate was, you shall not eat of these. So when you start looking at this story in any kind of detail, with any kind of anthropological edge to it, or archaeological or historical edge to it, you start to begin to realize right away, this is an allegory. This is a mythical tale that's describing the beginnings of mankind. Because there's two trees. One would give you knowledge, and the other one would give you eternal life. We know those don't exist. Unless, of course, God is who he says he is in the Bible. Those trees existed, and he got rid of them after the fact. So, but they were located at the center. And then along comes the serpent character out of nowhere. He's not a serpent. He's not a snake. But God curses the snakes because of it. That, again, is very much like a fable, an allegory. It's a story. And Eve looks at this fruit that he beguiles her with. And she sees it's beautiful and tasty looking. And that it looks like fruit that will give her wisdom. That right there is another earmark of this being an allegorical tale, a metaphor, a cover story. And so she eats it. She gives it to her husband, who's standing right there. He just happened to be just right there. He doesn't say anything about the serpent talking to her. He doesn't say anything. He's just there. So he's not jealous that we know of or anything like that. Who's this serpent guy you're talking to? Or was it supposed to be a literal serpent in the story? But we know it isn't, because the name of the serpent is Nakash in the Hebrew, which we know what that meaning is. The bright shining one, the bringer of enlightenment, of illumination, the bringer of knowledge. He's the bringer of chaos. Now, chaos being a neutral word in the text. The chaos, he's the one that turned things upside down. Does that mean he was doing something evil? No. And it doesn't name him Lucifer. It doesn't name him Satan. It doesn't name him the devil. This is Nakash. And by the way, this being, if this is the great evil, the evil person, maybe he's a good person that beguiled Eve and she just did what she wasn't supposed to do. Because he says, look, that fruit's not going to do anything bad to you. And she eats it. And all of a sudden they have knowledge. I think, by the way, this is it's a cover story for sexual activity, is what it is. If these people were real people, there's a lot more going on beneath the surface than what you see in this story. And so let's move on. The result of this, of course, they realize they're naked. And the consequences are absolutely devastating to the human race. And that God finds the couple, he curses them for disobeying his decrees, condemns forever all of mankind. All human beings will now forevermore be born with a sin nature, and according to the Baptist Church, be headed on the Hell Express. And the only way to get off of that, because of what Adam and Eve did, is to accept Jesus into your heart. And the Son of God, who is the perfect sacrifice. I mean, it makes theological sense when you parse down the whole story from beginning to end. It doesn't make common sense. So it's theology. It's a story within theology. And so this whole story of Adam and Eve, as you look at it in the Bible, it's about as mythological a tale as they come. It's rife with all the earmarks of every other culture's mythological tales. But in Judeo-Christianity, we're taught that this is the truth. It was God-breathed text. It's the Word of God. And so we come down to these things, and I mentioned them yesterday. It's either a myth that's not unlike the myths of all other cultures at the time. It's the absolute truth, despite resembling mythological tales of other cultures. And a third option is kind of like it could be the truth, and all other mythological tales are simply those other cultures' twist on the same story. And so we're left with that as we look at a story like this. And when you read that story, you've either got to be incredibly simple-minded to say, well, this is obviously how all of life on earth began, the Genesis 1 story. the Genesis 2, Genesis 3, all these things. This is obviously how man and woman came to be. A God created them, but there are so many holes on what the activities of a God who has that capability could do. It seems like he's sometimes limited by the things he created. Now, is that true? If God created free will, let's say, we have free will to choose God or reject him. We have free will as humans. If God created humans and God created free will, did he, by creating free will, put limitations on his own abilities? If he says, I have the ability to do this, that, or the other thing to you because you are my creation, I own you, I could wipe you out if I wanted to, but would he be, in so doing, violating the limits he put on himself when he created those things? So that's another way of looking at that, is God has created things and put on self-limitations by them. God, we had this stair-step dispensationalism, we call it, from creation it goes up to, different covenants that God made with different individuals throughout the Bible story, which finally culminated in God's own Son in the New Testament. And I used to say God was like a parent who could not understand how to deal with his child, but he had to learn along the way. Far be it from me to psychoanalyze God, if God is who he says he is. But here's a good question to ask yourself. When you look at the way God treated mankind, it goes from that commending all things to the wrathful God, to the so on, to the kind of this age of grace that exists. Is this just God, who he is? God limiting himself, limiting his powers? Wasn't the kenosis, the supposed coming of God in the form of Jesus, of his own Son, wasn't this, and it was called the kenosis in the New Testament, the limiting of God's power, the God creating himself as a human and emptying himself of his godhood to become a man, but then was also at the same time fully God, as the understanding grew. These are all things that we theorize on, we speculate on, and we go along with the biblical writers when they talk about these things. But is that just their theories, their speculations, their wonderings about God? Does God exist? Does God exist as we think he did? Do we live in a godless universe that really has nothing that controls it or keeps it together? That it is all nature? Did God create a universe that was self-sustaining, self-entropic? At the same time that it's expanding, it's also dissolving. So these are all questions to ask that come to your mind when you start thinking about God. But getting back into the mythology, there's more to this Edenic tale than we think, than what's on the surface. And whether you believe the account to be a factual account, a fictional account, an allegorical account, or a mythological account, there's an encoded message that's deep within the subtext of this passage. Because all of us, if we have a brain, you can look at this stuff and you can see beyond the surface to say, I gotta, kind of roll my eyes and smirk a little bit, because we all know there's more to this. This is obviously a mythological tale, even if there are real things at its core. I had one of my seminary professors tell me something. It was Dr. Charles Ailing, Chucky Ailing. He told me something a long time ago when I was in seminary, in like 1980, 81, somewhere in there. He told me something that is now familiar to all of us. But back then, almost 40 years ago, it was brand new information to me. He said, Scotty, he said, at the headwaters of every myth is a kernel of truth somewhere. That myth started in a real occurrence or a real event. Generally wasn't just made up shit. And this is what I think you have with the Eden story and the story of creation. At the core are kernels of truth, but the story is built on that into this grandiose mythology to set a theology in place. And whether you believe in this account to be fiction or not, there are different ways to look at it, and there are many things beneath the surface. The story of the Garden of Eden and its occupants, its inhabitants, and their fall from grace is more than a simple tale of disobedience, not eating from the tree and then eating from the forbidden tree. It's a tale of race interrupted, as I said yesterday. It mirrors many of the events we find in Sumerian culture. There are accounts of the Anunnaki who bred and enslaved primeval mankind. I looked at the cuneiform texts, and in their modern English translation, you've got Enlil, the chief god, saying to Enki, Ea, he says to him, let's create primordial man to do our work for us, to till our ground, to mine our natural resources, to dig our canals, and things like that. And so in Eden, Eve's downfall came as a result of her encounter with Nakash, this character that's described as the serpent. The encoded message in the whole Genesis passage applies that she had intercourse with the serpent character. And I'm not talking intercourse, which is, I can go out for coffee with you and have intercourse with you. We're intercoursing. But she had sexual intercourse, is the encoded message in this passage. And it renders the recorded bite out of a piece of fruit that created the fall of mankind as kind of small potatoes. There's more to this whole story. The serpent character, Nakash, he was, I believe, one of the Elohim, just by description. If he is Nakash, the bright shining one, the bringer of knowledge, the illuminator, you also see him in Psalm 82, that he is the character who was one of the bright shining princes of heaven that God is judging. One of those that set down foot on the slopes of Mount Armon in the whole Nephilim story. And it's one of these guys that seduced Eve away from the arms of her husband, Adam. Now, it's interesting to note, by the way, that Nakash, a version of that word, is used, the Nakashteh. When Moses, during the Exodus, the people are complaining, they're bit by snakes, God sends snakes, and then God says, all right, to heal them, put a brazen serpent on a pole, cast a serpent out of bronze. Bright, shining serpent was the word for the Nakashteh, and Moses raises it on a pole, and people could look to it and be healed. So it's interesting to me, God brought the serpents to punish the people, and then he also told Moses to make the bronze serpent so they could be healed from the bites of punishment that he sent for them. And that, of course, became eventually the Caduceus was formed, the medical profession. When you see the AMA, the American Medical Association, with the two serpents wrapped around, or the serpent wrapped around, you can find that really had its beginning in the serpent on the pole. And so this character is the one who lured Eve away from Adam. Now, did he actually lure her away? Had they even had sex yet in the garden? How long had they been there? But it seems that Nakash brought the illumination. He said, look, he says, this isn't going to kill you. He had sex with her. He impregnated her with Cain. And then it says she turned around and gave the apple to her husband, who was standing right there. And not an apple, a piece of fruit. And that he partook of it. And so he also tried this sex thing. And she was impregnated with Abel. And she bore these two boys that were fraternal twins, obviously. Nakash did much more. He buried in the encoded mythical tale and passed on to the first couple the forbidden knowledge of the Elohim, the pantheon of gods that was ruled by Elohim. And now, comparatively similar events took place when Enki, Ea, went to the humans and incited rebellion against the gods in the Anunnaki story. He passed on the forbidden knowledge of the gods to the humans, to Atrahasis, the king of Eridu, which was a real city and a real person. He's in the cuneiform texts. And he passed it on to them from Eden's den, Ea's den, his place. And for this treasonous act, Enlil condemns Enki and his followers from the heavens, the celestial place. They were condemned and ordered to remain underground in the earth, the Abzu, the great underground sea, as their domain. And within its vast cavernous systems weaving and intersecting throughout the substrata of the earth. And along with this, it was ruled that Enki was never to interfere with the humans again, and that their generations would not only never know each other, but will learn to hate each other and be in continual conflict, just as God pronounced there will be constant enmity between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the humans, and that it would exist in this offspring. And so this, to me, is an incredible story. I talked to Barry Fitzgerald. He was on Ghost Hunters International, Irishman. He talks about the things beneath our feet, the things underground, and all the things connected to these underground caverns. And we'll get into that more tomorrow, because guess what? We're at the end of the show. It's already the end of the second segment. It's the end of our hour together. Happy Friday evening, folks. Enjoy your weekend. Enjoy your holiday weekend. I may or may not be here on Monday. I probably will be, but we'll see what happens. And I'll be here. And so with that, I sign off. Have a good weekend. Stay tuned. We'll be back after the weekend. Enjoy it. Love you. Have a good weekend. Goodbye. Signing off. Bye. There. That's called the Minnesota goodbye, by the way.
I see fire inside the mountain. I see fire.